Hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Leeson, and I'm excited that you're with us for this particular study as we're going through the Gospel of John. Now, I just want to say for anybody that might be possibly coming along for the first time or second time and you're unfamiliar with 316, you might ask yourself, why do we call it that? Well, we've anchored all of these verse-by-verse studies to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, that reminds us that all Scripture is God-breathed. And He's given it to us as a profitable, useful tool for us to be corrected, for us to be rebuked, for us to be taught, for us to learn, in order that we might grow in the things of the Lord. So our hope in these studies is to take our time, walk in verse by verse through the Scriptures where we can, and hopefully we're learning, growing, and I hope these are a great blessing to you. Now, as said, we're in the Gospel of John, and we find ourselves in this particular study in part 10, and that's specifically leaning into chapters 18 and 19. And I won't go through any of the backstory of the Gospel of John as a context or John himself. We've done that in previous studies, but we're going to go ahead and jump in, bringing us to kind of a closing. We're headed towards the closing, and if you have been following along, you will remember this. If you're new with us, it's just important to understand that John chapter 13 through 17 is happening in one context. There should not be a break. You shouldn't read it with a break. It's all happening in the context of a day, an evening. Jesus is with the disciples, and he is giving them final words. He's going to talk to them about my peace I give you, not as the world gives. He's going to talk to them about that my joy might be in you and it might be complete. All of that happening in this final picture, the same night that he's going to share at the Last Supper with them. He's going to talk to them in John chapter 15 about abide in me, and if you do so, there will be fruit. He's going to talk to them in 16, I'm not going to be with you much longer. He's talked to them in 14, 15, and 16, I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit. And then in John 17, he has prayed for them. Following this prayer, they are going to begin headed to Gethsemane. This is where Jesus is going to be arrested. He's going to be taken before Annas. We're going to read about Peter's denial. We're going to read about the high priest, whose name is Caiaphas, questioning Jesus. Ultimately, he's going to get taken to Pilate, and then he'll be sentenced to be crucified. And we're going to stop at we'll touch on the burial. We won't read all of it verse by verse, but we're going to take it all the way through John 18 and 19. So let's hop in. It says, when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. So once again, we have had the Last Supper, as we would call it, this Passover meal. This is my body broken for you. This is the cup of my blood shed for you. And then he's prayed for him in John 17. And now he's going to cross towards the Kidron Valley. Now I want to show you, I'm going to hop over to some photos tonight in this study. So this is a look at the Kidron Valley. I'll kind of talk about what you're seeing here. This is an aerial drone photo looking down on the Temple Mount. So where you see what is called the Dome of the Rock today, that gold ball, that's where the temple used to sit. So when Jesus would come to temple, it was in the location that you will see today, the Dome of the Rock. You'll see the wall that goes around that whole area. That's called the Temple Mount. That whole area that's inside of that wall is called the Temple Mount. You'll see the green, kind of what looks like this embankment coming all the way down, and in present day you have a road down at the bottom. That is the Kidron Valley. So Jesus is going to come down from the temple area, or over on the Jerusalem side, down that hill, down into the Kidron Valley, and he's going to come to Gethsemane. Now, just for your context on the photo, where you see on Kidron Valley, the word Kidron Valley, down where the letters E and Y are, Gethsemane is down in that area. So he's going to come down the hill into Gethsemane. Now I'll show you one other photo looking from a different direction. This is further down the Temple Mount looking the other direction. So if that aerial view looked down on the Temple Mount, if we had taken the camera and shot straight down, we would have seen that that camera is up over Mount of Olives. So this is looking from the Temple Mount side. Mount of Olives is right to the right, and down in the bottom you can see an arrow pointing towards the bottom of the Mount of Olives. There is an olive grove called Gethsemane, and it's a term meaning for the crushing place. Now let's come back to our verse, and I'm going to show you actually a little more of the Kidron Valley in just a moment, but we're going to keep going here for just a second. I think it's interesting to know that Jesus comes down into a garden and he's going to pray, and I'm mindful of 1 Corinthians 15 that says, "For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive." Let me hop back once again. You think about Gethsemane, and you think about garden. Over in the book of Genesis, we know sin came in the midst of a garden by one man. And it's interesting that here in Gethsemane, the sacrifice of Jesus' life has not yet been made, but the battle, the contention happens down in the garden, where the cup of suffering, where Jesus is going to pray, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." And it's going to be down in this garden. Now, I want you to consider one more thing here, and that would be maybe prophetically for you to think about where the Kidron Valley actually releases to. So I'm going to give you an aerial view once again, and this is from kind of like a Google Earth type look. So let me explain what you're looking at. This is very, very high up, and you can see where the Temple Mount is. You can see the Mount of Olives across. So the very famous portion of the Kidron Valley is right in between the Temple Mount and Mount of Olives. In the Bible, you're going to have David go through the Kidron Valley. You're going to have Solomon in the Kidron Valley. You're going to have King Josiah, King Jehoshaphat, King Hezekiah. Numerous things around Jerusalem in the Old Testament happened in the midst of the Kidron Valley. But the Kidron Valley actually runs all the way back to the Dead Sea. So you can see the Dead Sea in the far distance. Now, I just want you to keep something in mind, and this doesn't relate at all to John 18 and 19, but it does have context to the Kidron Valley. I'm going to read with this up, so I'm not going to show you the verses, but this is just interesting for your own consideration and study, the significance of the Kidron Valley. So in Ezekiel chapter 40, God has given Ezekiel a vision of what is to come, and he has seen in this last part of Ezekiel, of his prophecy, he has seen the millennial reign. That's what we would call the still to come reign of Christ, where there's peace across the entire earth. And it says, in the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the fall of city. So he's giving context as to where he is. He's in Babylon area, and he's given timeline to how long they've been gone. He is not in Jerusalem, but he's witnessing something. On that very day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me there. In visions of God, he took me to the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain. And he's going to get a vision of Israel in the reign of the Messiah. And it goes in chapter 47. Listen to this. The man brought me to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple. So where you would see Temple Mount, this is what he is seeing in vision, water coming out from under the Temple Mount area toward the east, and in the direction of the Dead Sea is east, toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me out through the north gate and led me outside the outer gate facing east, and the water was flowing from the south side. Now, one more. Keep watching this. Verse 6. He asked me, Son of man, do you see this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river, and most scholars will say the fulfillment of this river's coming through the Kidron Valley. And it says, when I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. He said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the sea. That's the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, being the Dead Sea, the water there becomes fresh. The water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There will be large numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water. You know, the Dead Sea is also called the Salt Sea. It's so dense in its salt you can't sink. I've been in it. You literally float. Because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh, so where the river flows, everything will live. Ezekiel is seeing a fulfillment of the millennial reign of the Messiah, and it will flow amidst the Kidron Valley all the way to the Dead Sea. And there's prophecy about how these things will come and flourish in the Dead Sea. I find that to be fascinating. But bring us back to our study in John 18 and 19. So in John 18, now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers, some officials from the chief priests, Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Now, let's think about this. This is important, I think, in context. We know it's Passover. That means that Jewish people from all over Israel have traveled to Jerusalem. They don't necessarily live in Jerusalem. They've traveled to Jerusalem. So many times people would simply stay where they could. And the Mount of Olives and the olive groves were somewhere that probably had lots of people scattered throughout. And it's at night. So you have the temple guards coming, looking for Jesus, probably thinking there's going to be a fight. It's at night. That's why they have torches and lanterns. And they have weapons because they are anticipating hostility. There's been a great fervor around Jesus and great tensions to which the chief priests are trying to have him arrested, ultimately to be killed. The temple, which was led by and ruled by a group called the Sanhedrin, they had officials, or I should say guards. They had soldiers. They had police officers, let's call them, who could do a measure of policing. Let's think about security guards. In our day and age, you can have security guards that have a measure of authority. They do have a measure of authority. They might not have the same authority as police officers. They might not have the same authority as military soldiers, but they still have some measures of authority. Well, the temple guards had a measure of authority, not eclipsing Roman soldiers, but they could arrest people and bring them to the temple for trial. Imagine the Garden of Gethsemane and the Mount of Olives having a lot of people, and Judas knows exactly where Jesus will be, and so he's going to lead the soldiers there. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back, fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it that you want?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I'm he," Jesus answered. "If you're looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." So I want you just to understand the context. The temple guards have heard all this kind of fervor around Jesus. Some hold him to be a Messiah. Some hold him to be a charlatan. And those that hold him to be the Messiah, amongst the Jewish community, there were groups of people called the Zealots who were prepared to fight for their entitlement, who were going to obtain the rulership of Jerusalem and the Jewish people by way of force. Temple guards are going in ready for a night fight. And then Jesus steps forward so there's no night fight. And he says, I'm the one you're looking for. Let everyone else go. He is totally taking the lead entirely on behalf of the disciples. Now watch how Peter responds. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servants, cutting off his right ear. This was the very thing the temple guards thought was going to happen. So this is, Peter plays right along with the night fight and why they brought weapons. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Now pause here. So it's not recorded here in John, but we're going to read from other accounts of Gospels, other Gospel writings, that Jesus is going to heal the ear of Malchus. That's very important. This is the healing of Malchus' ear is going to be the last physical miracle healing that Jesus will perform before he is crucified on the cross. And it's important that that happens so that you don't have a night fight, so to say, and you don't have the remainder of the disciples being arrested. Otherwise, they would have been arrested had Jesus not intervened and handled it in this way. But I also want to lean on the fact of, he says to Peter, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? That's interesting, because just moments before, we read in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that he had said, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. The cup of suffering. And there is a point that when these soldiers arrive, that Jesus says to them, he doesn't say it here in John, but he says it elsewhere in the other Gospels, look, behold, my accusers have come, now is the time. He has concluded that the Father is going to not make this cup pass, and he is fully prepared to follow the plans of the Father. And so he leads that way and leads out to the soldiers in a way they're not having to search for him. Jesus is almost going to say, here I am. I know you're looking for me. So it's going to continue on. And says in verse 12, then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas. Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. Now, let me push pause here and go back to one more look of a map, and this is flying from the Mount of Olives, or not really flying, but standing on the Mount of Olives. This is a picture I believe I took. I've taken a lot of pictures while in the Jerusalem area, and I've also leveraged a lot of study pictures. But so I'm standing here on the Mount of Olives looking towards the temple location. The Kidron Valley is down below, and you'll see over in the far corner that the upper room is up towards the area of Caiaphas' house. That's very interesting, but that's the location, traditional location of where people hold that the upper room, this Last Supper happens. And Caiaphas is up in that direction. There's not a whole lot of argument by way of history that Caiaphas' home was in that direction, up on top of the mountain. I've actually had a couple opportunities to be in this particular chamber, and actually inside that home there's holding cells that you literally can look down in. And we one time were down in one of the holding cells that many hold that Jesus was inside of. It was a powerful moment being down in this holding cell and singing worship to the Lord. I exalt thee. Powerful, powerful moment. But he is taken from Gethsemane back across the Kidron Valley over to Caiaphas' house. Now, the reason I mention that is Annas, history, tradition shows that Annas lived in approximation to Caiaphas' house. So he's taken in that direction. Now let me bring it back once again to our look. And so we have Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because the disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. But Peter's going to start to be questioned. You are not one of the disciples, are you? The girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, I'm not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they'd made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Verse 19, meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. So what's happening here is that they are trying to soften Jesus up. They are trying to find a form of footing against Jesus. They're trying to form accusations against him. I'm going to lean on that as to, a little more as to what's happening here. But Jesus is going to say, I've spoken openly to the world. He replied, I've always taught in the synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why you question me? And ask those who heard me, surely they know what I said. One of the temple guards is going to respond to him in a real aggressive way. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. Jesus says, if I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong, but if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas the high priest. So they're up in that area. He is going to be taken now to Caiaphas' house. This is happening in the dead of night, and we're going to lean on some things here in just a second. But it says in verse 25 through 27, we're going to read more about how Peter's going to deny Jesus 2 more occasions, and the rooster will crow in that story. But that's not really what we're leaning on in this particular study. We can read that, but we want to lean on some other things because I want you to pay attention to some of the trial. So it says here in verse 28, then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. So pause here for just a second. So they have taken Jesus to Caiaphas' house. They have questioned him, and in this being at Caiaphas' house, there's going to be all kinds of accusations that are going to be made against him, and they're trying to implicate him. That's the word I'm looking for. They're trying to implicate him so that they can carry out their plan to have Jesus executed. There's something that is important to understand. The Sanhedrin, who ruled the temple, and their temple guards, and Caiaphas as the high priest over the temple, they do not have any right or authority to create capital punishment. They cannot, by Roman rule, they cannot execute someone. So what Caiaphas is going to do is he is going to try and get Jesus to implicate himself in a way that he can take that data, that Caiaphas can take that data with the Sanhedrin and take Jesus to Pilate to where they are able to call for and try and impose upon Pilate to have Jesus killed. So if we take all of that, kind of going to verse 28, you have, then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? Now let's lean on this because this is going to be real important. What was the reasoning that Caiaphas said, we've heard enough, and in the other gospels he rips his clothes and he says, that this man should die? They said blasphemy. that he had made a statement of equality with divinity. Pilate is going to ask, what charges do you bring against him? They're not going to say blasphemy, because Pilate would not have executed Jesus. He would not have allowed for the execution of Jesus according to a Jewish law. And they're going to be breaking a variety of the Sanhedrin, Caiaphas are going to be breaking a number of their own rules for capital accusation. And so if I show you one more in verse 30, if he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. They're saying with that statement, he is a criminal, not to us, he is a criminal to Rome. Now, if you were a criminal to Rome, then you were a criminal of capital punishment by a couple of different things. It might be treason. It might be a rebellion against the empire, against Rome itself. You could be brought up on trial for tax evasion or some form of manipulation, not paying taxes. That typically was not what brought about any form of capital punishment. But he is saying here, they're saying, if he were not a criminal, that's code for if he had not committed a crime against Rome, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. We would have handled it ourselves. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, the Jews objected. Like, we can't, because we can't kill him. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken indicating the kind of death he was going to die would be fulfilled. Now, let me just kind of leave that up and let me just talk about a couple things. I have a sheet here that if you want it, feel free to email me. You can just email me, pastorjoel@bridgeway.tv. I've sent this to a number of people who have followed along with the studies in the other Gospels. But the Sanhedrin, Caiaphas, are violating multiple of their own requirements for capital punishment cases, so to say. Number one is you can't change the laws, or you can't change your accusation. Their accusation against him is blasphemy, but to Pilate, they're not even really going to mention blasphemy. They're going to say he's an enemy of Rome. But I'll read just a couple of different things here. Number one, a person for capital punishment couldn't be accused by a private individual, but Annas already had. Number two, the legal proceedings could not happen at night, but they already did in the dead of night, and that's why they couldn't go to Pilate until early morning, but they had already created their own trial against Jesus. So they're violating their own rules here. The Sanhedrin, another one, the Sanhedrin were not allowed to bring capital punishment accusations against a person. It had to be brought up by witnesses. So you'll see in some of the other gospel writings that they're trying to manipulate people to make accusations. Why were they doing that? Because they cannot, by their own Mosaic law, they cannot bring about a capital indictment on him. So they need other witnesses. Capital offenses could not be tried on the preparation day of a Sabbath or of a high holy day. Passover was a high holy day that had a Sabbath coming off of it. And so they're violating that. Capital trials had to last more than one day. This is happening because Passover is going to be completed, or Passover is about to begin. They are trying to make this happen immediately. There had to be 2 or 3 agreeing witnesses, and they had to cast the first stones at the criminal. If the witnesses were untruthful, they were to receive the same punishment. So Caiaphas is going to make these accusations, and if he were found to be untruthful, that Jesus was not guilty of that, then by their own law, Caiaphas was on the hook for being judged too. They had to have a friend in court. Jesus did not have anybody. The high priest is not allowed to grandstand. They didn't use the word grandstand, but that's my wording of it. And we know that Caiaphas has been grandstanding the whole night. It had to be held in a proper court, and we know that the night before it's happening in Caiaphas' home. There could not be any forms of bribery involved, and we know that Judas was bribed. When the Sanhedrin took Jesus before Pilate, hoping for a death sentence to be carried out according to Roman law, they changed the charges from blasphemy to treason, which was illegal under the law of Moses. So once again, you could not change the charges. So I just want you to see kind of why this development with Pilate and the Jewish leaders plays out the way it is going to play out. So Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me? Like, what are you going to charge me for?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you've done? Like, are you violating their law, being the Jewish people? If so, that's not my fight." That's what Pilate was trying to say. If you're an enemy of Rome, then I do have to stand in this. And Jesus is going to say, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." To which this intrigues Pilate. "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You're right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And that componentry, that right there, is going to kind of challenge Pilate in that he's going to get intrigued by truth rather than the statement about a kingdom. "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." I don't find the basis that he is an enemy of Rome, is what he is depicting. "But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now, Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. So this is interesting. The word Barabbas, or the name Barabbas, literally means son of the father. B-A-R, being a term for son, and then Abba, or Abbas, being father, son of the father. It's interesting that they are calling out for the son of the father, and yet they're not referring to Jesus. They're referring to this criminal who led a rebellion, who obviously had been arrested, who obviously would be in holding for a sentencing of death because he had rebelled against Rome. And Pilate is willing to let him go, but my assumption is that Pilate is thinking there's no way they're going to ask for Barabbas. But then it says in verse 19, or chapter 19, we're switching, continues on from 18 to 19, that Pilate took Jesus, had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe, went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him in the face. And I've talked about this elsewhere, but in Roman culture, with Roman soldiers, they had a game that was called the King's Game, or it was the term Basilius. And if I just kind of explain what this is, the reason the drawing looks so bad is this is actually etched in stone. It's carved into stone. And you will find this not just in one location. Throughout the Roman Empire, you would find this at times. I wouldn't say it was everywhere, but you would find this game at times, and etched into stone. And there are a couple places in Jerusalem that this has been found etched into stone, where some Roman soldiers clearly would have been. What you have up in the top corner is that little box. It looks like 3 different boxes inside of one another. That would be the equivalent of what you and I would have with dice. That would be how soldiers would determine some form of who goes next, or call it how many steps or whatnot. The circle that looks like a wheel, the best way to understand that is that was framed as a crown. That would be according to whatever prisoner was being held and being beaten and being tortured. They would play this Basilius game according to which player would torture and mistreat this prisoner, and they called it the King's Game. They often would drape purple drapery upon them. They would take some forms of crowns. That's where you get this crown of thorns, and place it, bind it, and press it down on his head. Where you have over next to my photo, you would have the letter B, or the inscription for Basilius, where you have this scorpion. And I know that doesn't look much like a scorpion, but that was to depict a scorpion. That was a depiction of the Roman Empire. So you would have soldiers that would play this game in a way of torturing their prisoners. So I come back to this verse, and you can see the soldiers twist together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, clothe him in a purple robe. They are playing this game Basilius. It certainly appears. Once more, Pilate came out, said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no basis of charge against him, against Rome." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law. According to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now pause here. Just see the craziness of this. You have so much grandstanding by the chief priest, Caiaphas, and his entourage. You have Pilate, who is tepid. So it warrants me mentioning this about Pilate. Historically, Pilate is not a strong leader. Not just from what we have here. If you look at the Roman history and what comes with Pilate, he was not a high official. He was not a high leader. He is assigned a small area. He's a governor, and that might sound important, but Israel was not important or a threat to the Roman Empire. Pilate gets assigned to an area and to a territory that really didn't matter much to Rome, that really didn't create any kind of military kind of hesitancies, or we got to watch them, or got to be ready to battle. If you had a weak leader or a weak politician, you might put them in a place like Israel. You might give them an assignment of just keep peace within Jerusalem, just keep peace within this territory. And so much so you can see that Pilate is trying to one up the Jewish leaders, and they're trying to one up him. And he's like, "I see no basis for execution against him. You take him and you crucify him." But then the grandstanding of Caiaphas and the high priest is, "Hey, wait a minute. We can't do that. By Roman law, according to your law, we can't do that. That's on you to do." And then they go back from he's an enemy of Rome to we have a law, and that he claimed to be a son of God. To which Pilate could have said, "Well, that's not executable on our side." He is really being manipulated at a really pathetic way, if I'm just able to say it that way. So think about it like this. Have you ever watched in our culture on the news, or you've watched, if you've ever watched a politician or a mayor who is like chest out, like they think they're something, and they try and have this bravado like they're a great leader, even though they really only have a small sphere of influence, and they only have a really small sphere of power. But they are trying to grandstand. That really is what's happening between Caiaphas and Pilate. There is a grandstanding of very small power people who think they have power, and you have the very Son of God in the midst of them, and he is on trial between them. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" And you got to love Jesus' answer as the Son of God in the midst of this. He says this, You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. He just simply says to Pilate, you have no power over me. You have no power whatsoever over me. And you have this interesting play in the midst of this. Now, something to keep in mind as we see the next passage is that the one thing, the one responsibility that Pilate would have been given from Rome, from real Roman power, was keep the peace. If you're familiar with the phrase, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, the Pax Romana historically was from this period of 27 BC to 180 AD. And if you were assigned to a territory as a ruler, that really was your responsibility. Just simply keep the peace of Rome. And you have Pilate who is struggling to keep the peace, and that's his fear. So watch this. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. Like, you are not keeping the peace of Rome. We'll revolt against you. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stove pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation, Passover week, about the 6th hour. Once again, the king shouldn't be on trial on this day. Here's your king, Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. You really have at this apex is this tension for Pilate about how do I keep peace? And he is not a strong leader. He just simply is not. There's no way to depict him as a man of strength, where he is assigned and how he handles this. And you have the Jewish leaders, Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, who are violating all of their Mosaic law, but it ultimately is that the scriptures are fulfilled as to the kind of death that Jesus was to die. So it says, so the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Here they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, I'll just say one thing real quick here. There's an argument on location. If we traveled to Israel together, we would go into Jerusalem, and there's 2 locations that historically are argued for the location of Golgotha. One is called the Church of Holy Sepulchre, and then one is just outside of the city. There's lots of argument that is made by really high scholars about the defense of one over the other. And I will say, in close proximity to these 2 locations, there's a tomb that is argued for being also the tomb in which Jesus is buried. For the one outside of the city, you would have the Garden Tomb, which is close to this rock formation. We've been to both of them. And then also at the Church of Holy Sepulchre, there was a tomb area that was very close, literally right by it. And there's scholarship and debate about it. I think the best way of approaching these things is not so much where, because they're not too far from one another. I mean, it's very close, but just that it did happen. And the nature of worship and trust in the Lord is not on us to know exactly which location, but that it did happen. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but this man claimed to be the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I've written, I've written. So they're just saying, don't say that as a statement. That's what he said of himself. And Pilate finally tries to be defensive of himself. In verse 23 to 24, you'll see the soldiers bantering back and forth for his garments, and we're coming towards the close. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciples whom he loved standing, and most scholars will say this is John that he's referring to, he said to his mother, "Dear woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here's your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Now, I'll just say a couple things about that. Excuse me. Jesus is going to make 7 statements from the cross. According to the 4 Gospels, there's 7 statements that are made from the cross. John is going to depict 3 of them. One of them is this: "Here's your mother," to John, and "Here is your son," to Mary. And according to church tradition and church history, and of course you'll always have somebody who argues it, but according to what's been handed down in church tradition and church history, John would begin to take care of Mary, and that Mary would travel with John. John will eventually be in Ephesus. There's no debate about that history. John will find himself all the way in modern-day Turkey, what was ancient Asia Minor, in the town of Ephesus. And there's a tomb to John. When it comes to Mary, there's debate as to whether she was died and buried in Ephesus or died and buried in Jerusalem. And you'll get debate about that in both contexts. But he is entrusting her care now to John, and it's going to continue on. And it says later, knowing all was now completed, and so that the scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I'm thirsty." This is the second that John will depict of Jesus' statements. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge in a stalk and the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. There's all kinds of visual there that I don't have time to go into, but the fact that it's a hyssop plant, if you go all the way back to the Passover, I guess I'll go into it just a little. You go back to original Passover in Exodus chapter 12. What do? They sacrifice an animal. The blood's supposed to go on the door frame, over the doorpost, everything. What do they apply that blood with? A hyssop plant. So you see this hyssop plant both in original Passover and also showing up here in what's being lifted up to Jesus. In verse 30, when he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So the word "finished," this is the 3rd statement that John will record. And he's going to use the root word for teleo. And teleo was the idea of something that had come to a completion. So it really got leveraged in 2 directions. If you had a project that had come to completion, if you were using Greek words, you might say teleo or teleos. If you had a debt that you finally paid off, I finally paid off the house, I finally paid off the car, I finally paid off my student loans, you might use teleo or teleos. It was to complete something. And this visual of "it is finished" is carried over from Jesus in the cross. His assignment, it is finished. His work in being the perfect sacrifice, it is finished. The payment towards your sin and my sin, it has been paid in full, it is finished. The penalty of death, it is finished, and that will be completed from the resurrection. So you have this real powerful word of not just saying that Jesus is saying, "My time is finished," but he's saying a lot more that still carries over for you and me, that because it's finished by Christ, then it's not on us to have to finish it. We are able to receive the work of Christ by grace through faith and walk in the fullness of what he has paid for us. Now it continues on, and it says, "Now it was the day of preparation." Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Our phrase for special Sabbath could be a high Sabbath or a holy Sabbath. So anytime you had the feasts of the high holidays, those 7 feasts of the Jewish people, you would have this high holiday, this special fast. And because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. So let me just kind of lean on the legs broken. To die on the cross was a death of asphyxiation. The history, you can read it for yourself and study it for yourself. Death by crucifixion was a very long death. It was ultimately a death by asphyxiation, that your lungs collapse as your body weight just completely continues to sag, but it would be carried out over many days usually. So the thing to expedite the death would be to break the legs of a prisoner or the person being crucified, so they can no longer push themselves up to gain air in their lungs. If they can't push up, then they're going to die by asphyxiation at a quicker rate. And so that was the process. They would come and they would break the legs. Now, I also will just simply say about this special Sabbath, this high Sabbath. There's a lot of debate. Just anytime you have scripture, you have people that debate times, and have people that debate locations. Because you have this high Sabbath, there's a lot of debate that can happen as to when Jesus actually was crucified. There are theories of Wednesday, there are theories of Thursday, there are theories of Friday. And, I won't get into the arguments of that. It's just as we approach the scriptures, we understand there are debates, and typically from very scholarly people that hold different positions about when something happened or where something happened. But really the emphasis from the Lord is not so much the when or the where, but more so that it happened. And so then we continue on, and we're going to start to finish up here. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus, found him, he was already dead. They did not break his legs. He had given up his spirit. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it is given testimony. His testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. He's referring the theme throughout John, and from what John witnessed was that we might believe. It was all about belief. These things happened, verse 36, so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And as another scripture says, they will look on the one they pierced. Now, what happens in verse 38 through 42 is there's going to be pertaining to the burial of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea is going to ask permission for the body. I've said this before, but you didn't just get a body. A family did not just get a body for a prisoner that was crucified. That just was unheard of. You had to barter your way to have that body. There was not an honorable burial that was afforded to somebody that was crucified by the Roman Empire. You would have to almost bargain or barter with a soldier, almost like pay him off as they were taking a body away. You'd have to pay him off somewhere to get permission to have that body. Joseph of Arimathea is going to go and ask for permission to have this body. It's granted to him. Pilate agrees. And he's going to be joined by Nicodemus. There's going to be a preparation of the body, and then they're going to bury him in a tomb that is close by. Once again, the tomb is close by to the location of the crucifixion, and there's debate once again on two locations. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Now, with that, chapter 19 is going to come to a close, and we are going to finish our time together. I hope you'll take this study and wrestle with it. There's some things that I've kind of leaned in, some other things that I have not gone deep on. I would love to have you go deeper, study different aspects. All of it is so meaningful, powerful, but for the sake of time, we have to keep things moving along. I hope that this study has been helpful for you, maybe in seeing the Kidron Valley, placement of where Gethsemane is, where Caiaphas' house is. I didn't show you a picture of the palace that Pilate was in. He accommodated that location only for a short time. He was not assigned to the Jerusalem area for very long. It was not his palace, so to say. It would be like, how a politician will move into a home for his term and then he'll move out. Very same kind of thing. there in Jerusalem. I've got photos of that location if you want to see it. If you want those rules or laws, some of the laws from the Mishnah, which was Jewish order, as to what the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas violated, feel free to email me, Pastor Joel at bridgeway.tv, and I'll send that sheet to you. But I hope you will take the study further, and I hope that you can join me as we close out not only the Gospel of John in our next one with chapter 20, chapter 21, but also closing out the 2024 run where we have studied verse by verse Matthew, Mark, Luke, and now into John, and we're almost finished. Hey, with that said, God bless you, and I'll see you for our last one.